Policy Working Group deep dive session. We are a small, persistent, sometimes passive-aggressively scheduled working group. Sometimes not meeting at all, but sometimes working a lot of stuff. So Erica and I, and also with the help of Isui, will walk you through overview of the working group and some of the interesting cases we are looking for in the next year. Okay. So a quick overview. So it was really thrilled for us to see Brian G mention policy as part of the big picture for next year for Kubernetes. So well, from his word, envision Kubernetes as the policy framework. Of course, there are many choices and problems that we need to address, which Erica will talk in depth later. Well, from ourselves, of course, we'll find policy are needed and also designed, scattered around the Kubernetes ecosystem. Policy descriptions are domain-specific in nature, so it's not only in the sense that Brian mentioned, in the Kubernetes domain, but also in a larger context. Like, for example, the utilization of the policy, whether it is used for audit, security, network, or vertical industry adoptions. If it is used in finance, you're gonna need many financial jargons, or using telco, pharmaceutical, whatever. And also languages, right? Usually, we treat it out of scope for work group, our task. So it would be great to see maybe someday there emerge a unified policy language. Might be great, but not part of our core work here. What we are focusing on is policy semantic, or the control mechanism we believe that could be universal and generally described. So our mission is try to avoid, to reinvent many of the views already available, and try to provide a overall architecture that could encompass both the past and the current and the future policy-related stuffs in Kubernetes. So just give you a sense of the scope, as commonly defined in Kubernetes working groups are something that works across the SIGs. So basically, we are touching upon policies that beyond, so many SIGs. For example, SIG-auth, scheduling will be storage. You can do policies for snapshotting, given certain time interval to do that. Also, network. Not only in the sense of network security, but also SDN controllers, you can define which way you want the packet to flow, right? And also domain-specific architectures. We have so many of these things now for AI, which could be also policy-driven, and also multi-tenancy. And our output is something like those, design document. Maybe we will have new policy proposals. Erica will talk about the unified format for next year. So this is what we do, basically. A little bit of history. So the discussion started almost a year ago, and we start the momentum this year, I think. So can't believe it's already almost a year. We have weekly meeting. We try to have weekly meetings. So we try to have a sense of development cycles. So basically, our cycle is half a year. So we call it's summit targeted. So we corresponds to 2 cycles of Kubernetes. Okay, many of the things we do is to have a running list of our interested items. So this list is for the fall cycle, basically 1.12 and 13 for Kubernetes. So as you can see, so we have like Yisui's work on the security profile, many the sub KPs discussed, and initial like alpha implementation planned for the 600, I think. And we have something expect to design conclusion in 13. Service topology achieved that. Scheduling policy, I think also, but need to migrate to KP, right? Yeah, great, which is great. Namespace initializer, part of the security profile, still in discussion. And also long-term, we just keep an eye on, like metadata and QBatch, since you have to treat the batch ones and non-batch ones. So there's a co-scheduling policy in place. Okay, new items. So I'm gonna invite Yisui up to talk about the new multi-tenancy use case.
Thank you. My name is Yisui, a software engineer working for Google. So this particular use case is brought up by Sanju from Cisco regarding the network policy to be used in some sort of multi-tenancy environment. Sanju is present today? No. So I will describe the use case briefly. So the idea is in a certain multi-tenancy use case, when the namespace administrator has full control of all the policy objects inside namespace. And they will set up a baseline of the network policy to block certain traffic between the namespace and also like outbound and inbound traffic. While the admin want to grant the developers the permission and allow them to define the firewall rules by themselves, and particularly for their own ports. But they want their rules will be restricted by some ground rules they cannot break. Based on today's network policy, it's impossible to do that because either you don't allow anybody to write a new network policy, or you allow them to write a network policy. Basically, they have capability to override anything in the existing system network policy. The reason is when there are multiple network policy rules appears, they are aggregated, used, and finally use the most relaxed rules. And that's basically the problem. And in practice, there's a few ways we can do that. For example, an old school way is the developer write an email to the network admin and say a bunch of justifications, say, can you open this port for this port? But that's less automated. And the other way is kind of like if the Kubernetes cluster is managed by a config as code, that means when you want to change something, all the manifest files are managed in the Git repo, and you send out a code review, say, oh, this is the change of network policy, can you review that, and then approve and commit. That still relies on human review process, not something like quite automated. So this actually brings up a problem in the policy space. How can we define policy that can be multi-tenant user-friendly? And this is still quite an open question. I see Sanju came, so would you like to describe your use case in more detail? Why a specific use case is in your case?
No, I think you described it and we discussed it offline later.
Okay, okay.
So the basic thing is that we're trying to build towards a using
Yeah, so as some of the multi-tenancy efforts are still at an early stage, we're looking at what are the different areas that need support for multi-tenancy. And when it comes to network level isolation, starting off with namespace separation, today the way RBAC is set up for network policies, if I use network policies to isolate namespaces, then I cannot give write permission for network policy objects to developers because they may inadvertently start using another namespace. But we do want them to have full network policy capability because they want to do microsegmentation within namespace. So this is the thing, yeah.
So just leave this open question in particularly for this type of policy objects. So maybe we can have further discussion offline if you have any idea or thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, so next, Erica is going to talk about the new proposal.
Hi, I'm Erica. I think about policy a lot. So stepping back of what do we mean by policy can be kind of a catch-all. That seems like there's some kind of administrative thing here. Sounds like policy. The definition I'm kind of going with is deliberate system of principles to guide decisions. The important part about it is that it is a guide to make decisions. So it's kind of policy has a meta level to it. Policy is not your configuration. Policy can be configured. Configuration can be how you define your policies, but they're not the same thing. It's not authentication or authorization. While those can play into it as well, it's in the space, but it's not just like a program, if that makes sense. We have a little bit more that we're trying to usually do with it. And it's not just security, it's another thing. And if I would add another bullet point, nor is it just about compliance and government stuff. So what's painful about policy today, in terms of the format, because I got a lot of other things that are wrong with policy, but they're all scoped differently. Defaults are specified differently. There's no common terminology, no common way that they're composed. So what we could do better, some standardization, consistent composability, and giving people the tools to doing that. So the base concepts of what we need for policy is are the identity of who or what we're applying policy to. This is kind of the input to a policy. So an example is how the container image, if we have policies around that applied, we can identify by tag or better by digest. Most of the time, the identity we're dealing with in Kubernetes is the resources, including like the network via the authorization steps. We need to know what the set of possible outcomes will be. If we don't have a clear idea, we can't guarantee anything correctly with policy. So we need to know if, this is a routing, if it's a network policy or something, what it is that can actually apply to the decision of what to do. The other part is the state. This is a hard one because Kubernetes doesn't deal very, very well with this. What is the other information we need to uniquely determine an outcome? Sometimes, so for instance, if we break down for a pull policy, all of the things that go into should the kubelet repull an image, the state about what node the pod is in matters, its spec matters, whether that image is on the node, whether that always pull images, admission controller is enabled, et cetera. And of course, we need the rules. So we need to make our mapping it's like a functional, with the input identity, what our kind of state space is going to be and what the outcomes are. So these are the parts that allow us kind of to identify consistent policy. policy composition. Conflicts arise when you have more than one policy that would give different decisions and no authority. One doesn't have authority over the other necessarily. So ways you can deal with it are make sure that there are formal ways to compose rule bindings and work very well because they're only there's no like deny kind of other way that could make things conflict. Everything's additive. Topology for nodes do this as well. We can do what's called the Lattice Model, which is priority ordering. This is probably one you're familiar with, and it's because it's really the way we think usually is in this kind of thing, that this has a higher rank than something else. The other way, sometimes though, this is done like very arbitrarily, or who knows how they're sorting something and then applied. Or sometimes there's kind of sort by how restrictive they are. Only allow one policy per thing. That's one way you can get rid of any problems. Or you can kind of use a combination of these things to make something that kind of works. So the example I was thinking was priority classes. You have the admin creates the classes, and the pods can kind of pick the class. Yeah. And it's that separation of concerns by having a named kind of class boundary. So with all that in mind, some of the baby steps we would like to take to have a consistent format. Use priority ordering. Explicitly define a priority on every object or policy object. Mostly keep to admission controlling because it gets very complicated if you attempt to try to do kind of more like runtime decisions, which means mostly we keep it clear with allow, deny, very clear outcome set. Mostly cluster scoped, and then use namespace selectors. We're basing this on, one, what customers or users seem to need. They need the admin usually to be the one defining the top level policies, and they want it to apply to even namespaces that don't exist yet. So using selectors. You can further kind of narrow down what applies. The other thing that these are static policies as much as possible. As kind of the example or the scheduling policy we've been using as kind of a way to talk about and think about these decisions. So we can see the priority, the allow, deny, the rules for namespace, pod. Where you are selecting on just key value pairs for like in the spec, it's very easy. Sometimes you have policies on top of basically policies when you have other selectors and defining other selectors. That gets more complicated to compose. I think a little bit still of an open question of how best to handle that.
You probably want to make the naming more consistent. The namespace selector, there is a dash below it. I think it's array, right? You probably want to use it plural and all other things. I think you want to make the naming a little bit consistent. I think it's very hard for those 4 rules, it's kind of difficult to correlate.
Can make sure I understood some of the names consistency. Oh, haha. Well, that is kind of a weird one because you can think of it either way, right? Yeah. Oh, wait, Tim, did you have a comment?
So the standard design is that you're talking to people who have no idea what it is and see what their first reaction is.
Yeah.
And I think you are probably the expert in this area, but you want to make this work for readers.
perhaps just
Just on that specific one, pod selectors and namespace selectors, there's a standard metadata.label selector object, and it has within it a match expressions field. And so I think this was just a kind of a sketch, and I think the actual API would have that.
Yeah, yes. I should say there's nothing, there's no like alpha API that you have to worry about. We can still fix things. Yeah, it's kind of weird. Selectors are set-based matching operations. All right, so the long-term vision of what would actually get us where we need to go, huge majority of our policies are just about a kind of validation, which could be defined and done much better with strongly typed system. If we're also kind of with the latest in programming languages, having algebraic types allow us to more easily define complex resources, as well as have things that can act on those and compose in a certain way. Yes?
So how do you do that in the face of custom resources?
So yeah, it can go mostly on top of existing resources, right? Think of.
I don't understand how you would have a strong type system when you don't know what the types are.
So, no, well, their type right now is maybe not, is somewhat weakly defined. Yeah, one of the problems, this kind of like TypeScript, there'll be type any probably for a while. But in general, I think we could start with like union types or something like that, with the base objects of like a pod or something, and where at the end your output can still be the same pods.
Can I make a comment on that? The new version of OPA using the common expression language, and the common expression language can handle both JSON and the schema. So basically, is that if you embed a JSON inside a schema, and the expression can go deep into the JSON,
Yes.
right? And so that one is that you can still.
We have open API or the schema for custom resources. I don't know how widely it's used, but.
Yeah, so that means like if that JSON later on has a schema, the policy does not need to change. You just say A.B.C, and it basically will just chase down the path.
What I'd like to kind of move towards is having certain guarantees for different parts of the system. If something needs to only have a stricter number of allowable fields, have a way to define that. If we want to have different kind of admission chains where we can have them explicitly define the ins and outs in a stronger way. That's the kind of thing I'm thinking of. I think it will fit in very well with OPA because once you have the just kind of strong guarantees on what these types are, you can really use any language like OPA to compile your policies in a reasonable way. The other thing is where the policies get evaluated and put. There are a couple places we have like the I call it life cycle, the admission deletion kind of cycle. There we have a lot of like admission hooks, deletion hooks, not really, it's kind of weird. There's some kind of open question we'll discuss later on that one. Of course, the traffic is one place things come in and out. We have like a BPF place to kind of insert certain kind of in a similar vein. When pods start up and down, like actually are executed. And of course, API calls. Webhooks often don't work well. The latency, the problem that if that connection is down, you lose your system is like gated from you or completely open. So I think we should think about what would it look like to have a different type of plugin mechanism within the API. I don't have a very good idea for what that could be, but use of capabilities. This is not the capability like I can access to an object tied to the resource itself. No kind of, so like an example, I was thinking pods, kind of leases, if that makes sense. Your ways to pass around access as to objects so that in a delegated way, constantly kind of change and reevaluated. This one I need to flesh out more. I think we need to be explicit. Oh yeah.
On the previous slide, on this slide, are you thinking that the access control is represented as some token that gets passed around?
It is sort of right now, yes, and making that even more explicit in terms of how you can pass that around and scope the access and who has rights to it.
Yeah, like keys, just pass down the capability.
Kind of, yeah. My pod leases thing was one of the things people asked, okay, well, if something changes, like we just got new CVE, we were able to, stop a pod from being created, but now that we have new information, we want to not have this vulnerable pod running. When is the policy going to be reevaluated? This is always sort of a problem of when do you reconcile with the current state. How often that is a risk calculation, really. It's what level of error is okay. But a common point of this is maybe no pod should ever live forever, but should constantly kind of have to be renewed, their lease renewed.
I think that's one of the problem with admission, since it's admission time. Once you pass the admission gate, you'd have to reconcile to reapply the policies. So, yeah, I think that's something that is worth to explore, because policies, to my opinion, are not something static. They move forward. So, yeah.
Though, I mean, to a certain degree, though, like, if you look at like RBAC as a policy, right? Like, if you can do something at some point, and you also happen to be able to like create role bindings at that point, you can give it out at that point, have your access for both, but the access stays around, because the policy decision is being made at a point in time, and the fact that you can delegate it is also being made at that time. So.
All right, then the other thing is Kubernetes is now, there's a kind of always this conflict between having a richer set of information that you can pull on and the way Kubernetes is designed. Etcd is not Postgres. It's not gonna work very well for like pulling out relational data like policies can be. If we have information kind of tied externally or to, for instance, signatures on images or the vulnerability scanning results, there's quite a lot of external information that can be pulled in, and that doesn't work very well. So if we think very explicitly about how the flattened, that this is sort of the compiled state, not the one that can show you exactly the human readable thing that it came from, which through kind of the typing, I think this can make it a lot easier. We can preserve a lot of the ways that people want to share components and such, and be able to have share different cluster plugins without having to stuff a bunch of history into an annotation. So what are some actual next steps that we could actually do, rather than some well, that sounds maybe whatever. Okay. Number one, I think, is everything in namespace. It doesn't have to be a namespace. So for instance, like an organization for groupings of users or access, or if you have like, I don't know, zones for node pools. The important part is every resource is in one and only one of these. The thing that makes like label selectors so difficult and kind of hard to reason about is anything can be labeled anything with as many kind of labels as you want, which means you don't have a lot of ways to really kind of narrow down to a specific thing. Having it's the beginning of a type in some sense. It makes it a lot easier to reason about these things, especially also when we start mapping between our different topology layers. There's the workload. We have workloads. We have services and network connections. We have the data plane of mostly volumes and the data contained in those. There's the external access users in the API. I might be missing one more layer. All of those then can have policies and things that interact with each other. Very obvious example is scheduling. The scheduler sort of is a big policy machine that makes decisions about which node something goes on. So we have this relationship, and we're trying to define certain policies around from the, that was the infrastructure, the actual machines. That's the other layer we need. You're mapping between like your machines and a pod, or really the kubelet and the pod. Can get very confusing very fast with like taints and tolerations and affinities. But I think most people would find it much easier if they knew, like, this is a master node and this is a worker node was much more explicit, and you knew it was going to be labeled one of those, and you wouldn't be able to create it if it wasn't. That can be very useful to make things not so bad. Some way to keep some context kind of in stamps of approval or something. So maybe just immutable labels or annotations. Rather, there's been suggestions about like having access control on the annotation level, having metadata objects. That's still a conversation to have. I could see where you actually don't want anyone to be able to read the annotation. But for starters, if you just make sure that if something puts on the annotation, probably one, it shouldn't collide, and that the user someone else isn't going to be able to stomp on that. Yeah.
It says immutable labels or annotations. Can we just pick one?
They kind of would have a little bit different ways you'd be using them, I guess.
Yeah, I know that.
Probably, yeah. I would say annotations. Does anyone think labels? I don't know.
Yeah, because I know like every feature is used by someone, and now the problem is that if some policy apply to labels, some apply to annotation, and some will apply to both, then it's very difficult. As an admin, I look at the cluster, it's just very difficult to reason about it.
This is true. I believe the intention is more annotations containing more, not like machine readable categories, but larger information. So for instance, you could have a like verified label and a signature in the annotation, right? They're overlapping though, for sure. The last one, improved ownership. This is I think would make things a lot easier for a lot of people if they could just make sure things are cleaned up and tied together properly. We can try to see how to get ownership across namespace. I'm sure API machinery people are going to tell me exactly how hard that is and why it's never going to happen, but it's something we can push forward. Object pairs are something that kind of can put things together very easily. I think it's kind of, you shouldn't have to create a custom controller just to kind of have something that's one layer on top of a pod. It seems like we could help a lot of people build things by just, if you have this thing is just tied to this one very explicitly. Yep. All right. That is, I'll link to, I have a doc with some of this, and I'll link to it in the slides for more discussion.
Okay, so another set of issues that we might take a look next year, like the irreversible delete for the external systems. And also, the Azure guys has the Kubernetes Policy Controller, which is pretty nice, work with OPA. We are also looking forward to work with them next year. So just feel free to join the meeting, and if you have something you want to discuss, just comment on the minute doc. And we have been trying some of the invited talks. I think it runs pretty well, like OPA, Cilium, if you have a certain subject that you want to discuss, just feel free to reach out to us. Okay, CNCF-wide, we have a still information security SIG, depending on the TOCs. And I got many questions, so there's a slide, although mostly same people, but the CNCF side, we are mostly a top-down approach because everything is so nascent. It's still possible to do top-down, but in Kubernetes, we are mostly bottom-up, try not to disturb many of the things are working now. Okay, thank you very much. And any questions? I'll be serving the mic, and Erica will answer.
Sure.
So this is just a newbie question because I haven't attended this group before. It seems like you're dealing with objects and features that are being spread in a number of other groups.
Yep.
Pod security policies, network policies, all kinds of other things, right?
Yes.
So what is the mechanism this group chooses to adopt to either directly make proposals or influence those groups? What is the...
In general, it's not too hard to do that just based on the kind of more democratic model of Kubernetes itself. We keep an eye on the PRs, and we're able to comment on those and really engage in discussion right then. So I don't think we've had too much of an issue with people want help standardizing. So I think we get people pushed towards us quite often. So that's how I think we just do it. Keep an eye on the proposals, comment to see if they'll kind of change a word to be a little bit more in line with the other policies.
So all these proposals that you were running through, are those some things that you would now need to work with different teams that are dealing with, let's say, pod security policies or whatever?
Yep. Yes. Yeah, for instance, we're doing scheduling policy, so you're like, that's done in scheduling. And there's input from both sides, from the policy and from the scheduling side. And it's going through that SIG.
I have a general question about the effort for the unified policy types. So there seems to be a trade-off here that
yes.
The more general purpose your configuration is and more flexible it is, you lose usability, right? Or the other way to say, the more specific.
There is a trade-off, but I don't think it's a linear trade-off or curve at all, because if you don't make it general enough, people have a lot of stuff built around it that can be more complex and obtuse than if you had a better, more generalized way.
Sure, but if you look at current RBAC
yes.
Types, I have a very hard time seeing how it can be simpler using a more general mechanism. But my question is more general than this. Is do we have an opinion on where that balance lies as a whole, or not?
That was what I was trying to kind of think about with the flat thing. That was where my thoughts were kind of if you have something that being able to express it is complicated, OPA probably is a better choice, which means we need something that we don't have to mash all the information together. Like, I would prefer a little bit more for RBAC, a little bit more squashed, if that makes sense. No, I don't. If there's a way to not have dead objects, I think that would be good. But yeah, I don't know.
Just to follow up on the question, we could do something like having, some resources at the Kubernetes level, and at the back end having some policy engine that compute the policies. So we can have both, and also when having something that is more generic, like for example, one of the slides where we showed the scheduling policy, this allows us to be flexible because often users have use cases where they want to, for example, allow by default, but some other users wants to deny by default. So having some generic mechanism to say you could override the default behavior is often helpful, I think.
Oh yeah, we didn't touch on defaults in that right now. I'm just burying my head and pretending they don't exist. But the normal answer for things like this is have good interfaces, right? And places where you kind of plug into that.
One question about the metadata policy. I think it was merged back in 2016 or something like that.
Which one? Sorry.
Metadata policy. There's a design proposal that is... Yes, there's one that predates, I think, which was merged back in 2016. I wanted to know if it was inspired or it was a rework of this policy, or is it something that we want?
I don't remember at this point. I think there was.
Okay. So
there was
if it's
further.
Okay, if it's
things.
this. Okay, if it's this one, then it refers to the design proposal that was proposed by Brian back in the days, I think.
Yeah, I think there's been a couple different ones, right? It's hard to tell. Images or issues can stay open for quite a while. It's always fun when you're like, wait, what's the answer? Oh no, there's a 200 comment discussion thread and they didn't come up with an answer. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And it's already like 10 minutes past lunch. Okay.
Oh, is that what now is? That's good. Thank you.
Thank you.